The train stopped for the third time sometime before dawn. No announcement, no explanation. Just the groan of brakes applied too hard, the shudder running through the carriage from front to back, and then stillness. The kind of stillness that feels deliberate, that feels chosen by something larger than the men sitting in the dark, trying to understand it. Amir pressed his face against the gap between the carriage slats. Outside there was nothing. Its black tree line against a sky that was beginning, just barely, to separate itself from the darkness below it. A field of some kind. Wire fencing running along a road that disappeared in both directions into nothing. No station, no lights, no reason he could see for the train to have stopped here rather than anywhere else. From somewhere further up the carriages, a voice said something about partisans on the line. Another voice disagreed. A third offered bridge damage as an alternative. Nobody confirmed anything because nobody knew anything, and the not knowing had been the condition of their lives for long enough now that it had stopped feeling unusual. Kamal, sitting against the opposite wall with his knees drawn up and a stub of pencil resting on the back of a German supply form, did not look up. 11 days, he said, from Poland. Amir took his word for it. Kamal had been keeping the count since Krakow, marking each day in a column of short lines the way men in certain kinds of confinement have always marked time, turning duration into something that can be held in the hand, examined, verified. The pencil marks were precise. Kamal was always precise. It was the thing about him that Amir had first noticed in the camp and had come to depend on in the months since. This refusal to allow the facts to become approximate, even when approximate was all that the situation offered. 11 days. Fine. 11 days it was. Danny was asleep. This was, Amir had decided, either the most remarkable thing about the boy or the most alarming. He was 19 years old. He had been captured at Kerch after 3 weeks of service. 3 weeks in which he had presumably learned the basic mechanics of a rifle and not much else. And he had been in German captivity for 7 months before the officers came to the camp with their lists and their questions. And he had signed the form without reading it carefully because the alternative was visible in the faces of the men around him, and he had looked at those faces and decided that he would rather take his chances with the unknown than remain in the presence of something he understood too well. And now he slept on a German troop train, moving through the Polish night toward a destination that none of them had been told in any language they completely trusted, in with his head tilted back against the carriage wall and his mouth slightly open. The way children sleep when they have decided that the world is someone else's problem until morning. Amir watched him for a moment. Then he looked back through the slats at the darkness outside, and he thought about what Kamal had said about 11 days. And he thought about the particular mathematics of how a man arrives at a point in his life where he is sitting in a German troop transport heading east and thinking of this as an improvement. The camp in Poland had been designed, as far as Amir could determine, not to kill quickly, which would have required a decision, an intention, a commitment of resources, but to allow killing to happen on its own, through the ordinary mechanisms of neglect, hunger, cold, disease. When the particular cruelty of enforced idleness, which is not the absence of suffering, but its purest form, because it removes even the distraction of purpose. He had arrived there in the autumn of 1941 after Kharkov. He had been a junior lieutenant in the Red Army, which meant that he had been given responsibility without authority, information without context, and orders without explanation. A condition that prepared him, in retrospect, reasonably well for everything that followed. At Kharkov, he had led a platoon of 31 men through 4 days of fighting that he had not understood tactically and could not have explained strategically. And on the 5th day, the position had collapsed in a way that nobody on his level had seen coming, and he had found himself in a field with his hands above his head, watching a German soldier who could not have been older than Danny is now pointing a rifle at him with an expression of exhaustion rather than triumph. The camp was a field surrounded by wire. The winter came. The food, which had never been sufficient, became less sufficient. Men who had arrived with the solid build of farmers and laborers became, over weeks and then months, something different, something that happened to faces when the architecture beneath them became too visible, when the eyes went to a particular depth in their sockets, when the skin took on the color and texture of old paper. Oh, you could watch a man disappear across the span of 3 months. You could watch it happening to yourself. Kamal had been there since Sevastopol. Kamal never talked about Sevastopol. What he would say, when pressed, was that it had been a long siege and that he had been on the wrong side of it. And then he would say this with a brief movement of something across his face that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else, and he would return to whatever he was counting. When Amir had eventually stopped pressing, when the German officers arrived in early spring with their lists and their interpreter, a thin man in a civilian suit who spoke Russian with a Moscow accent and German with something else entirely, they asked for volunteers from the Caucasus, from Azerbaijan, from Georgia and Turkestan, and the various other places that the German military had determined, through some combination of intelligence and ideology, he produced men whose loyalties might be redirected. The interpreter read the offer. Service in a German auxiliary battalion, pay, rations, uniforms, the chance to fight for the liberation of their homelands from Bolshevik tyranny. The German officer spoke for 4 minutes. The interpreter translated for 90 seconds. Amir, who had enough German from 2 years of pre-war study to follow the original imperfectly, noted the difference in duration and filed it away. He signed. Kamal signed. So Danny signed without reading the form carefully because he was 19 and because the form was in German and because Amir was signing, and that was enough. The training at Jeddah had been, by any honest assessment, perfunctory, basic infantry skills, most of which the men already possessed from their service in the Red Army, supplemented with German tactical terminology that sat awkwardly in mouths accustomed to Azerbaijani or Russian. They drilled, and they marched through Polish fields in the autumn cold, 963 men in German uniforms, learning to respond to commands in a language that felt, as one man put it, like chewing gravel. The German NCOs who ran the training regarded them with the particular professional neutrality of men who have been given a task and intend to complete it without forming views about the task's ultimate wisdom. They taught what they were asked to teach, and they did not ask questions about what the men would be used for. Amir paid attention to the German tactical terminology, not because he believed in what it represented, but because competence in the available language was the only form of control available to him. And control, even the minimal control of understanding what was being asked of him before it was demonstrated by someone else, was worth maintaining. He learned the commands. He learned the ranks. He learned the words for march and halt and fire and take cover, and he noted that these words in any language pointed in the same directions and produced the same results, which told him something about the nature of command that he had suspected and now confirmed, that it was fundamentally independent of the specific language carrying it, a structure that existed prior to words and used words as its vehicle rather than its substance. He also, in the evenings after the drills had finished and the men had been returned to their billets, continued to think about the gap between the commander's German and the interpreter's Azerbaijani, and about what that gap meant for the 963 men who had heard only one version. He did not share these thoughts. There was no one to share them with who would have found them useful, and there were people nearby who might have found them inconvenient. Kamal knew. Amir could tell by the way Kamal occasionally looked at him during the commander's addresses. A brief sideways glance that contained no specific message, but acknowledged that both of them were receiving the same 2 broadcasts simultaneously and were separately deciding what to do with the difference. Kamal's decision, Amir suspected, was the same as his own. File it, note it, do not act on it, because acting on it would produce outcomes worse than not acting on it. And the information was already incorporated into the calculation, which is all that information can be asked to do when the situation does not permit direct response. They had been given German rifles, Karabiner 98s, the standard infantry weapon, accurate and reliable and heavy in the particular way of things designed to last rather than to be convenient. They had been given German rations, German mess kits, German canteens. They had been given in a ceremony that managed simultaneously to be routine and to feel significant, the uniforms with the crescent patches on the right sleeve. The patches had been made by someone in a supply depot somewhere, cut from fabric and stitched with the Gothic lettering that spelled their identity in a language that most of them could not read. Amir had held his patch and looked at it for a long time. It said in German that he was Azerbaijani. It was the most honest thing the German army had told him. 963 Azerbaijanis and 40 Germans left the staging area at Jeddah in September 1942. The Germans were the command cadre, officers, NCOs, signal section, men who communicated through a chain of translators that added 15 minutes to every order and transformed whatever precision the original contained into something more approximate and more pliable by the time it reached its destination. The German battalion commander addressed them once, in the training camp, through the same Moscow-accented interpreter. He spoke about the liberation of the Caucasus, about the oil fields, about the gratitude of peoples freed from Bolshevik tyranny. The interpreter rendered this as something about going home, about fighting for their land. Most of the men heard what they wanted to hear. Amir heard both versions. He stood in the third row and listened to the commander's German and the interpreter's Azerbaijani simultaneously, the two streams running in parallel, and then he registered the gap between them with the specific clarity of a man who has learned that the gap between what is said and what is meant is where the actual information lives. The commander had spoken about oil fields and strategic objectives, and the gratitude of liberated peoples. The interpreter had spoken about going home, about fighting for land that was theirs, about a future that waited on the other side of this service. The men around Amir had leaned forward slightly as the interpreter spoke, their bodies responding to the word home before their minds had finished processing it. Amir had not leaned forward. He had looked at the interpreter, a thin man from Ganja who had been an engineering student before the war, and who now stood between two armies, translating each into something the other could accept. And he had understood that the interpreter knew exactly what he was doing, that the softening was deliberate, that the transformation of strategic objectives into the language of homecoming was not a failure of translation, but a choice. The choice of a man who understood that 963 men standing in a camp in Poland needed a reason to walk toward the Caucasus, and that the actual reason that they were being used as auxiliary labor for an army that did not trust them and could not replace the men it was losing was not a reason that would produce willing movement. He signed anyway, because the interpreter's version, however false, pointed in the same direction as the truth. East, toward home, toward the mountains that were at least the mountains of the right continent. The alternative was visible in the faces of the men who stayed behind, and 963 Azerbaijanis and 40 Germans. The manifest listed them in those proportions, as if the ratio itself were a kind of order, a numerical expression of who was in charge of what and how much trust was being extended in which direction. On the right sleeve of each Azerbaijani uniform, they stitched a small shield bearing a crescent and the word Azerbaijan in Gothic script, as if that small piece of fabric could answer the question of what exactly they were. They were not German soldiers. They were not Soviet soldiers. They were not, in any sense that the available legal and military categories could accommodate, exactly anything. They were 963 men in German uniforms with crescent patches, moving east on a train that stopped 3 times in the night without explanation. The Krasnodar region announced itself through the carriage slats before anyone opened the doors. The air changed first. After weeks of Polish flatlands and the scorched steppe beyond Rostov, a landscape that was beautiful in the way that pure function is beautiful, without ornament or ambiguity, there was something in the wind that carried moisture and elevation, a heaviness that pressed against the chest in a way Amir recognized without being able to name, the way you recognize a voice before you can place the face. When they finally slid the doors open at the marshalling yard, a stretch of crushed gravel and stacked fuel drums under a sky the color of wet slate, he understood. The mountains to the south, barely visible through low cloud, carried the silhouette of the ranges he had grown up watching from the eastern side. Different valleys, different names. The rivers ran the other way, but the same spine of rock running east to west, the same way the peaks dissolved into weather rather than ending, as if the mountains were not finished but merely interrupted by the inconvenience of the sky. Downey stood beside him on the gravel with his kit over one shoulder. He said the mountains looked like home. Like the approaches to Sheki, he said. Maybe Zagatala. Not exactly, Amir told him. Help with the crates. But the boy was right, and they both knew he was right. And that was the problem. That was the specific problem of standing on a gravel marshalling yard in the occupied Caucasus in a German uniform, looking at mountains that looked like home. The problem being that home was on the other side of those mountains, and the army that was trying to reach it was the one that had run the camp in Poland, and the army that was trying to stop it from reaching home was the one that had put him in that camp in the first place. The mountains did not care about any of this. Kamal appeared beside them, made a note on his supply form, and observed that the weather looked like it was going to be a problem. He was, as usual, correct. There is a particular kind of man that every war produces in quantity, though history tends to undercount them because they do not fit easily into the categories that history prefers. They are not heroes in the conventional sense. They are not villains, and they are men who found themselves at a specific intersection of geography and politics and bad timing. Men for whom the question of which side to be on was not a philosophical question, but a survival question, and who answered it the way survival questions are always answered. Not with ideology, but with the body's own logic, which is simpler than ideology and more honest and considerably less interested in being remembered well. In the spring of 1966, WWII, a 20-year-old from a small town in rural Alabama, received his draft notice on a Tuesday morning. He had not chosen the war. He had not chosen the side. He had not chosen the rice paddies or the jungle, or the particular combination of heat and fear and confusion that would constitute the next 14 months of his life. He had chosen, like Amir, the only option that kept him breathing, which is to say he had not really chosen at all. So he had simply responded to the mathematics of the situation, which left him with two columns: go or face the consequences of not going. History tends to talk about wars in terms of ideology, of belief systems and strategic objectives, and the clash of civilizations. It does this because ideology is legible, can be written down, argued about, assessed in retrospect as having been right or wrong. What history is less comfortable discussing is the number of men in every war who were there, not because of ideology, but because of the alternative. Because the alternative was a camp in Poland or a federal prison in Alabama, or a future that had been foreclosed by circumstances they had not created and could not have altered. Men who signed the forms not because they believed in what the forms represented, but because the body has its own logic, separate from belief, and the body's logic is simple. Continue. 963 men stood on the gravel at Krasnodar in September 1942. Not one of them had been asked what he wanted. The German battalion commander met with the company officers on the third day in the staging area. His name was a collection of consonants that defeated every attempt Amir made to reproduce it, and he communicated through Farid, the engineering student from Ganja, who had been their interpreter since the camp. A thin, precise man whose German unsettled the Germans because it was too accurate, carrying in its precision a quality of observation that the Germans had not asked for and did not entirely welcome. Farid translated everything. He translated faithfully in both directions. On one occasion, and one occasion only, he had added his own commentary. The observation, rendered in Azerbaijani after the commander had finished speaking, that the Germans had been losing men and mules on the supply routes at a rate that was making the mountain troops nervous about their logistics. He had said this without expression, as though reporting the weather. Amir had filed it under the same category as the translation discrepancy at the training camp. Accurate information delivered through an unofficial channel by a man who understood that official channels were not always reliable. The commander spread a map on a crate and explained the assignment. The 4th Mountain Division, the Enzian he called it, gentian after the alpine flower, as if naming a division after something that bloomed in high meadows made the mountains it was fighting through more manageable, was pushing south through the passes toward the Black Sea coast. The original objective had been Sukhumi. The immediate objective was now Tuapse and the coastal road. Their battalion would provide rear area security along the supply routes that fed the advance, counter-guerrilla operations, convoy protection, the trails between the forward positions and the depots in the lowlands. He said this as if it were a minor administrative detail. Kamal caught Amir's eye across the map crate, but said nothing. He was already calculating. When Amir could tell, running the numbers on what supply route security in active partisan territory actually meant in terms of personnel requirements, patrol frequencies, convoy intervals, and casualty rates, and arriving at conclusions that the commander's tone did not suggest he wanted arrived at in this room. Amir asked about the partisan situation through Farid. The commander paused, folded one corner of his map, and described it as active. Particularly active, he added, when in the forested valleys east of Hadizhensk, where the supply trails narrowed to single-track paths between walls of beech and hornbeam. Soviet irregular forces had been attacking mule convoys for weeks. 3 supply columns had been ambushed in the previous 10 days. Losses were described as moderate, which in the vocabulary of staff officers could mean almost anything. Walking back through the staging area after the briefing, Kamal said, "We are the throat, not the fist." He meant it precisely. As they would not be advancing, they would not be attacking Soviet positions or carrying the offensive toward the coast. They would be keeping open 12 kilometers of forested valley trail through which everything the advancing troops needed had to pass. Every mortar round, every bandage, every tin of rations that reached the Gebirgsjäger on the ridges above had to move through this throat. And someone out there in the forest they were about to enter was trying to close it. Ernst arrived at the company position on the morning of the second day. He was the Austrian NCO assigned as liaison to Amir's platoon. A Gebirgsjäger from Innsbruck, compact and deliberate in the way of men who had grown up at altitude, with the particular economy of movement that comes from years of navigating terrain that punishes waste. He carried his left arm slightly stiff against his body, yet the result of shrapnel at Sevastopol that the surgeons had decided to leave in place on the grounds that removing it would cause more damage than it was causing by staying. He communicated primarily through gesture, demonstration, and a handful of Russian words pronounced so badly they functioned more as signals than language. When he wanted the platoon to move, he moved. When he wanted them to stop, he stopped, and they stopped. When he wanted them to listen, really listen, not the passive reception of sound, but the active processing of it. He stopped, tilted his head very slightly, and waited. The first time he did this on patrol, half the platoon looked at him as if he had heard something specific and alarming. The other half looked at Amir for guidance. Amir asked Ernst, through Farid, what he was listening for. Ernst made a gesture that took in the entire forest, the trees, the sky in fragments through the canopy, the stream below, if the wind and branches beginning at their edges to turn. Then he said something in German that Farid rendered between breaths as, the sound of things that have stopped making sound. This required some thought. Then it made sense. The forest had a baseline, a continuous low conversation of wind and water and birds and small animals that constituted, when you were not listening for it, simply silence. But it was not silence. It was texture. To mind anything that disturbed that texture registered as a wrongness in the pattern, a silence inside the silence. Ernst had been learning to hear that wrongness for a long time. Amir began trying to learn it too. The first village they passed through was called something that did not translate cleanly into any language Farid could manage. A name that was more topographic description than designation, referring to a place where 2 streams met below a particular kind of ridge. It was 20 houses, maybe 25. Wooden construction, the roofs heavy with the anticipation of snow, the yards containing the practical combination of stacked wood and earthenware vessels and agricultural tools that characterize subsistence at altitude in any country at any point in history. The people who had remained were old men and women and children. The younger men had gone to the Red Army, or the mountains, or the grave, it in proportions that no one could accurately estimate from the outside. They watched the column pass with expressions that shifted depending on who was watching and what they were watching for. To Ernst, Amir suspected, they were potential partisans or at minimum sympathizers, which in the calculus of rear area security amounted to the same operational response. To Amir, they were something harder to define. Caucasian people. Not Azerbaijani exactly. The architecture of the faces was different. The language coming through the walls of the houses was not a language he recognized, but close enough in some quality of presence, some way of standing in a doorway and watching strangers pass, that it produced in him a confusion he had not expected and did not know what to do with. Danny was near the back of the column. Amir noticed as they were clearing the village that the boy had stopped. He was standing by the road looking at something. Amir moved back along the column to where he stood. An old woman was sitting on a low wall at the edge of her yard, shelling something into a clay bowl held in her lap. She was not looking at Danny. She was not looking at the column. She was working with the complete attention of someone for whom this task has been performed 10,000 times and requires no portion of consciousness beyond the hands. And she was humming. The melody was not one Amir knew. It was not Azerbaijani. It was not Russian. It was something older than either of those categories, something that had been in these mountains before the names that divided them had been established, moving through the woman's throat without apparent effort, the way water moves through familiar ground. Danny was completely still. Amir watched his face. The boy's expression was not sentimentality. He was not on the edge of tears. Nothing so legible as that. Why, it was something more like recognition. The recognition you feel when something reminds you not of a specific memory, but of the shape of memory, the feeling of what it is to have a place you belong to. His grandmother, Amir would later understand, had sung something with the same shape, not the same notes, not the same words, but the same movement through the same emotional territory, the way two rivers running through different countries can still be recognizably rivers. Ernst had stopped too. He was standing 3 feet from Danny, his stiff arm held against his side, looking at the woman with an expression that was not tactical, not the assessment of a potential threat, just listening. An Austrian from Innsbruck and an Azerbaijani from Sheki, and a former Red Army officer from Baku, standing on a mountain road in a country none of them had come to willingly, listening to an old woman hum a melody that none of them had heard before and all of them somehow recognized. And then a mule somewhere ahead complained about its load, and the column lurched forward, and Amir said quietly to Danny, "Move." The boy moved. The woman kept humming. The column passed through the village and out the other side, and the forest closed behind it, the way forests do when they have absorbed something and return to themselves, as if the intrusion had never occurred. Kamal, who had seen none of this from his position at the front of the column, was waiting at the tree line with his supply form and his pencil. He noted the time and the distance covered and the condition of the trail ahead, which he described as manageable but deteriorating. He did not ask what had taken the rear of the column so long to clear the village. Amir did not explain. That evening, in the tented position on the eastern edge of the staging area, Amir sat with Kamal and tried to write the first patrol report. The pencil felt strange in his hands. Not because his hands were shaking, they were not, or not much, but because the act of writing, of converting what had happened into the official language of incident reports and route assessments, required a kind of translation that left too much behind. You could write column passed through village, no contact, population observed, one brief halt. You could not write, an old woman was humming, and we all stopped and something happened that I do not have a category for. See, Kamal produced a tin of German field rations. He divided it into 3 portions with the precision of a man who had learned in the camps that the division of food was the one ritual that could not be approximate, that must always be exact, because approximate was how men began to lose the sense that they were still something other than what the camps were making them. They ate in silence. Outside the tent, air of the mountains to the south were black against a sky that held the last thin band of light along the western ridge. From somewhere to the south faintly came the sound of artillery, a low intermittent thudding that could have been thunder if thunder came in measured intervals. Kamal asked where the front line was. Amir told him he did not know. Kamal nodded, as though this were the answer he had expected. He made a note on his supply form. He capped his pencil and tucked it behind his ear. Somewhere above them, beyond the immediate ridgeline, beyond the passes that the Gebirgsjäger were fighting through toward a coast they could almost smell, the war was proceeding according to plans made in rooms far from this mountain by men who were not sleeping in this tent. 963 men who had not been asked. Kamal, who was 35 and had survived Sevastopol and the camp in Poland and 11 days on a German troop train, and who had a system for everything, and who kept the count when no one else kept the count. Kamal looked at the mountains and at the last light fading behind the western ridge and said nothing, which was, Amir had come to understand, the most precise thing he could have said. The offensive began on the 14th of October. They did not see it start. They did not hear it start, or not directly. And the front line was far enough south that the preliminary bombardment reached them not as sound in the conventional sense, but as something felt in the sternum. A low continuous vibration that belonged to the category of physical experience rather than auditory experience. The way you feel a large engine running in a building before you hear it. The way the body registers certain kinds of pressure before the mind has finished deciding what to call them. So Amir was standing at the edge of the relay point when it began, looking south at the ridgeline above which the Gebirgsjäger were fighting their way through passes named after rivers and saints toward a coastline they could almost smell. The vibration came up through the soles of his boots and into his legs, and he stood there for a moment, simply receiving it. The way you receive news that you have been expecting long enough that its arrival produces not surprise, but a kind of grim confirmation. So it starts, he thought. Then Kamal appeared beside him with his supply form and told him that the convoy schedule had been revised. The new intervals were 3 to 4 hours. The previous intervals had been 8 to 10. Amir looked at him. Kamal looked at the mountains. "We are going to be very busy," Kamal said. On the supply route they guarded was 12 kilometers of forested valley trail, running south from a depot outside Hadizinsk to a relay point where the mountain troops maintained a small garrison. It climbed steadily from the lowland orchards and cornfields north of the town through increasingly dense beech and hornbeam forest, crossed 4 stream beds of varying width and reliability, passed through 2 sections where the trail narrowed to single file between rock faces, and emerged finally at the relay point on a small plateau where the tree line gave way to open ground, and you could see, on clear days, the ridges above which the fighting was happening. It was, as a piece of terrain, unremarkable. It was also, as Kamal had correctly identified on the first day, the throat. Every mortar round, every bandage, every tin of rations, and of every replacement barrel for a machine gun that had overheated and warped after sustained firing, all of it had to pass through these 12 kilometers of forested trail, carried either on the backs of mules or, when the mules could not manage the grade, on the backs of men. And every meter of that trail was Amir's responsibility, divided between 4 platoons of roughly equal strength, or each attached to a German NCO who spoke no Turkic language and communicated through whatever combination of gesture and broken Russian and sheer force of professional example he could manage. Ernst had been in these mountains since August, which made him, by the standards of this particular campaign, a veteran of the terrain if not of the specific situation. He had developed the habit of stopping at irregular intervals during patrol to listen, his head cocked at a slight angle, like the stiff left arm held against his body, eyes moving through the canopy overhead, with the particular quality of attention that Amir had begun to recognize as something beyond training. Something closer to instinct or to the learned approximation of instinct that long experience in dangerous places produces in men who are still alive precisely because they have learned it. Amir had been practicing. He was not yet as good at it as Ernst. He was getting better. Both the first ambush came on the 4th day of the offensive. His platoon was escorting a mule train, 6 animals, 4 muleteers, a load of ammunition and medical supplies, along the southern section of the trail. The weather had been building for 2 days, a low-pressure system moving in from the northwest that had turned the sky. The uniform gray of old pewter and reduced visibility in the forest to 30 meters in most places and less in others. The air smelled of rain that had not yet arrived, of wet bark and mineral earth, and the particular organic density of a forest preparing to absorb water. They were in the narrow section. Amir had noted this with the part of his brain that cataloged risks without acting on them, because avoiding the narrow section meant a detour of 4 kilometers along a ridgeline that added 3 hours to the transit and was in its own way equally exposed. The narrow section was a passage perhaps 15 meters long, where the trail squeezed between a rock face on the left and a steep drop on the right. forcing the column into single file with no room to move laterally in either direction. It was, from the perspective of anyone wishing to stop a column, the obvious place. He thought about this. He did not stop. The first burst came from above and to the left. What happens in the body when shooting starts is not what the mind, in its peacetime deliberations, imagines it will be. There is no moment of heroic assessment, no tactical calculation, no conscious decision to take cover. What there is the body acting before the mind has finished receiving the information. A sudden compression of the self downward and inward. A going to ground that happens with the automatic totality of a reflex, and then the mud receiving you, cold and immediate and absolute. And then the sound still coming, and the mind catching up to what the body already knows. Amir was in the mud before he had consciously decided to be there. Around him, the men were doing the same. Some dropped their loads, some pressed into the rock face on the left side of the trail. Some simply stopped where they stood, frozen in the particular paralysis of men being shot at for the first time since the circumstances of their captivity had turned them back into soldiers. The mules stood motionless in the peculiar, frozen stance of animals that have learned, through some combination of training and terror, that noise means stillness rather than flight. Kamal was ahead of him. He heard Kamal before he saw him. A sustained bark, not words exactly, but the sound of a sergeant imposing order on chaos through sheer force of professional will. The kind of sound that bypasses language entirely and operates directly on the part of the brain that responds to command. Gilmer, the forward section, was moving before Amir had fully registered the direction of fire. They scrambled up the slope toward the tree line, firing as they went at targets they could not identify, but whose approximate position they had calculated from sound. The partisans were invisible. The muzzle flashes came from deep within the canopy, brief orange blooms that appeared and vanished without human form attached to them, so that the firing seemed to come from the forest itself rather than from people in the forest, which in a sense was the point. It lasted 4 minutes, possibly less. Time under fire does what it always does. It stretches in some directions and compresses in others until the clock becomes meaningless and only the body's rhythms remain. The mud under his chest was cold and smelled of rotting leaves and something mineral, iron perhaps, or the particular smell of disturbed earth. He could taste soil. He had pressed his face into the ground hard enough to take some of it in, and the taste of it, wet, dense, alive in the way that only the very surface of the earth is alive, was something he would not forget for a long time. Then it stopped, not gradually. All at once, the way a radio is switched off, the forest reasserted itself. Wind, water, the creaking of branches, and in the absence of gunfire, these sounds seemed almost aggressively present, yet filling the silence with a normality that felt wrong, as if the world had returned to its ordinary business without acknowledging what had just happened in it. 2 men were hit. One, a soldier from Baku, whose name Amir was not certain he had ever learned correctly despite having seen the man every day for weeks, had taken a round through the shoulder that broke the collarbone and exited below the shoulder blade. He was conscious and making a low continuous sound that was not quite a scream and not quite speech, the sound of a body processing damage before the mind has fully caught up with what the damage means. The other had been grazed across the ribs, a furrow of torn fabric and torn skin that bled impressively but was not serious. 2 mules were dead, a third was wounded, and Ernst put it down with a single pistol shot behind the ear and then stood for a moment looking at the animal, with an expression that was not sentiment exactly, but was in the territory adjacent to it. The look of a man acknowledging something that the situation does not provide time to acknowledge properly, so he is acknowledging it as briefly and completely as he can before the situation reasserts its demands. The ammunition the mules had been carrying, 200 kilograms of it, plus mortar rounds and signal flares, was redistributed among the men for the remaining 8 kilometers to the relay point. The pace slowed to something barely above walking. Amir's platoon spread across the trail in a formation that was neither textbook nor improvised, but something in between. The product of men who had just learned that the trees on either side contained people who wanted to kill them and were in the process of revising their understanding of what the trees meant. And they reached the relay point at dusk. The Gebirgsjäger there, gaunt and dirty and moving with the economical slowness of men who had been at altitude too long, accepted the supplies without comment. Their sergeant asked Ernst something in German. Ernst answered briefly. The sergeant looked at the Azerbaijanis, at the crescent patches, at their faces, and said nothing more. That night, Amir sat with Kamal and Dani and tried to write the contact report. Kamal told him to eat first, when he said he was not hungry. Kamal pointed out that nobody was hungry and that this was precisely the problem, and produced a tin of gray German field ration paste and divided it into 3 portions with his usual mathematical precision. They ate. The mountains above them were black against a sky that held the last thin band of light along the western ridge. From the south, faintly, the thudding continued. The morning after the ambush, Ernst woke Amir before dawn and indicated, or through the combination of gesture and expression that had become their primary mode of communication, that he wanted to show him something. They walked back along the trail to the narrow section in the early morning half-light, the forest still holding the particular hush of the hour before birds begin. Ernst moved ahead, the stiff arm against his side, his footfalls producing almost no sound on the wet earth. Fi and Amir followed and tried to move as quietly and failed, and stopped trying and simply followed. At the site of the previous day's ambush, Ernst left the trail and climbed the slope to the position the partisans had fired from. It was a prepared position. Logs stacked for cover, sight lines cleared through the undergrowth to give unobstructed views of the trail below. Professional work, patient work, the kind of work that takes hours and requires knowledge of the terrain. Amir examined it. Then Ernst crouched beside the earth behind the log stack and pointed. Footprints, not boots, not the deep-treaded military boots that left the distinctive impressions Amir had been trained to recognize. These were the marks of something softer, something with a flat sole and minimal structure. Work shoes, perhaps, or sandals reinforced for mountain terrain. The people who had fired on them from this position were not soldiers. They were farmers, villagers. The same people who had watched the column pass through the valley with expressions that shifted depending on who was watching. The old men and women and children whose men had gone to the Red Army, or the mountains, or the grave. Amir stood in the prepared position and looked down at the section of trail where his men had been in the mud 24 hours earlier, and he understood what he was looking at and what it meant. He did not write any of this in the patrol report. Sorting Ernst did not ask why. He had been a Red Army officer. He had been trained to produce accurate reports, to render what happened into language that command could act on. He had done this for weeks. He would continue to do it. But there are things that accurate language cannot hold without breaking. The sandal print in the mud above a trail where his men had been lying with their faces in the earth, the knowledge of what that print meant about who was in these forests and why, and the further knowledge that writing this accurately would produce a response that he did not want to be responsible for producing. Some gaps between what happens and what gets written are not failures of record keeping. They are decisions. He had made his. They walked back to the relay point in silence, the forest around them beginning its morning conversation of wind and water and birds. And Amir thought about the woman humming in the village and about Donnie's face when he had heard the melody, and about the fact that the people trying to kill them were not enemies in any ideological sense he had been trained to process, but simply people who lived here and did not want what was happening to happen, which was, he supposed, something he understood from the inside out. He thought about this for a long time. He did not arrive at a conclusion. And the rain came on the 18th of October. Not the intermittent afternoon rain they had grown accustomed to. The predictable daily curtain that fell for 2 hours and then lifted, leaving the trails wet but passable. This was different. This was a commitment, a sky that had gone uniformly gray from horizon to horizon, without variation or break, producing a vertical wall of water that descended on the mountains and did not stop. Within 6 hours, the trails had changed character. Within 24 hours, they had changed nature. What had been difficult paths became running streams of brown water, carrying mud and stones and pieces of fallen timber in a continuous downhill flow. The steeper sections where the trail climbed through switchbacks cut into the valley side began to dissolve. Not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, section by section, as the root systems that held the hillsides together became saturated and released their grip. The mules refused. This was not cowardice or stubbornness in the conventional sense. It was information. The animals' hooves told them what their eyes could not confirm, that the ground beneath the surface was moving, was no longer the stable medium through which weight could be safely transmitted, and the mules, who had no investment in the objectives of the 17th Army or the progress of the Tuapse offensive, they've responded to this information with the complete rationality of creatures uncomplicated by ideology. They stopped. They stood in the rain with their heads lowered and their legs braced and would not move, and no amount of pulling or shouting or the application of whatever persuasion the muleteers could devise changed this calculus. The supplies did not move themselves. Kamal developed a method. He divided the men into relay teams, 8 men per section, under each section responsible for moving a fixed quantity of material over a fixed distance before handing it to the next team. This reduced the total distance any one man had to walk and allowed for rest periods in which men could collapse in whatever sheltered spot the trail offered. Under overhanging rocks, in the gaps between tree roots, once in what appeared to be the entrance to a fox's den, whose original occupant had made a sensible decision about company. Amir's platoon carried supplies for 16 hours on the 19th. 16 hours of walking uphill and sliding downhill, of sinking into mud that gripped the boots and released them with a sucking sound that became the rhythm of the day, of rain so constant and so thorough that the concept of being wet lost all meaning, because there was nothing left to compare it to. Dry was a memory. Dry was a word from a different season, a different country, and a version of the world that had existed before the sky decided to end it. The rest periods lasted 10 minutes, then Kamal's whistle, then movement again. Ernst walked alongside the column during these days, his stiff arm held against his body, his face carrying the expression of a man doing a continuous calculation whose result he does not like. At one point he stopped Amir on the trail and said something in German that Farid, who happened to be carrying a 20-kilogram crate on his back at the time, rendered breathlessly as, "The lieutenant says this is not going to work." Amir asked him what specifically was not going to work. Ernst made the gesture, the one that took in the trail, the rain, the mountains, the general condition of human endeavor in this latitude at this time of year, in this war. Amir told him to keep walking. Ernst kept walking. On the 22nd of October, Tarlan died. The day had begun with a section of trail giving way. Not the entire trail, but a section of perhaps 15 meters where the slope above had been saturated beyond what the root systems could hold, and the hillside had simply let go, sliding across the path in a mass of mud and stones and fallen trunks that buried the trail to a depth of more than a meter. The column stopped. The mules stood. Where the men looked at the obstacle with the automatic assessment of soldiers who have encountered obstacles before, calculating whether to go over, around, or through. In that moment of stillness, that pause of perhaps 30 seconds during which the column was bunched together in a space of 20 meters, fully exposed, attention directed at the obstacle rather than the slopes above, the firing started. It came from both sides. From the slope above, where the hillside had collapsed, and from the slope below, where the valley dropped toward the stream. A crossfire. The partisans had used the mudslide, had perhaps caused it, though Amir would never know for certain, to create a killing ground, and the column was standing in the middle of it. The sounds come back in pieces. The flat crack of rifles, the deeper thud of something heavier, a machine gun or a weapon he could not identify. The screaming of a mule that had been hit, a sound unlike any human sound. I mean, mechanical and total and sustained. His own breathing, ragged and fast, the breath of a man who has just understood the situation and whose body has responded before the understanding was complete. Kamal's voice somewhere ahead, saying something he could not make out. The snap of a round passing close enough to his ear that he felt the pressure change. Ilger was hit first. When he was standing near the lead mule when the firing began and took a round through the thigh that dropped him onto the mudslide. He slid downhill in the muck, trying to hold his leg, his rifle lost somewhere in the brown water, his mouth open in an expression that looked, from a distance, more like surprise than pain. The pain Amir knew from his own experience would arrive later, after the adrenaline receded and the body began to comprehend what had been done to it. Tarlan went to him. And this is the thing about Tarlan that Amir would carry for the rest of his life. Not the fact of what he did, which was the kind of thing that happens in combat and is later explained by the language of valor and sacrifice, language that is accurate but insufficient, but the way he did it. He did not crawl. He did not assess the situation and determine that the risk was acceptable. He stood up and ran. Across the open section of mudslide trail where the firing was heaviest, Washi in a straight line toward where Ilgar was lying, running with a particular quality of physical urgency that has nothing to do with bravery and everything to do with the inability to watch someone you know suffer without doing something about it, regardless of what the doing something costs. He was hit once in the side before he reached Ilgar. He kept running. He was hit again in the neck. He reached Ilgar. He was dead before the medic arrived 30 seconds later. After the return fire from Kamal's section had suppressed the position on the upper slope, and the partisans below had withdrawn into the forest, and the forest had swallowed them as it always swallowed them, completely and immediately, as if they had been made of the same material as the trees. Tarlan lay in the mud beside the man he had come to save. Ilgar was still conscious. The medic worked on them both. He could save one of them. He did. Later, when they had carried Tarlan to the relay point on an improvised stretcher made from 2 branches and a length of canvas, Roof searched his pockets for identification, the standard procedure, the paper trail that the German forms required. He found it. Not identification. A piece of paper folded twice, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. An address in Sumgait, written in careful Azerbaijani script. The kind of script a person uses when they are writing something they want to be read correctly, when they are writing something that matters. A girl's name at the top, though it was a name none of them recognized. An address below it. Nothing else. Ralph held the paper for a long moment. Then he folded it again along its original creases and put it in his own pocket. Nobody said anything about this. It was understood without discussion that someone should hold it. Why that it should not be lost with everything else. That night, Amir wrote 2 reports identical in format, differing only in the entry for status. One reading wounded in action, one reading killed in action. The German forms had spaces for name, rank, unit, date, location, circumstances. They did not have spaces for what Tarlan had been before the war. A carpenter's apprentice from Sumgait, 20 years old, who kept a folded address in his pocket and had died in the mud of a Caucasus forest, reaching for something that had nothing to do with the 17th Army's objectives and everything to do with the particular quality of being human that survives, sometimes even in conditions designed to eliminate it. He filled in the forms and gave them to Ernst for the battalion records. Ernst accepted them without comment. His jaw was tight in a way that Amir had not seen before. In November of 1969, at a place called My Lai in Vietnam, American soldiers killed civilians in a village. The investigation that followed would last years and produce a literature of moral complexity that the United States is still in various ways working through. But what the investigation and the literature both circled around without ever fully resolving was a simpler question. The same question that the footprints in the prepared position above Amir's trail had posed, that the sandal marks rather than military boots had made unavoidable. What do you do when the enemy is not the enemy? When the people shooting at the convoy are the same people you passed in the village with the humming woman, the same people whose children Danny kept giving portions of his rations to despite being told to stop, the same people whose faces carry a quality of recognition that suggests they have been here before, in a different uniform, during a different war, and have learned that the best position is simply to wait for the current wave to pass? There is no answer to this question that satisfies. There is only the choice that gets made, and the report that gets written, and the gap between them, which is where the actual history lives. Amir did not write what Ernst had shown him in the prepared position. He did not write about the sandal prints. He wrote, "Partisans fired from prepared position on eastern slope." He wrote, "Column returned fire." He wrote, "2 casualties, 2 mules, 160 kilograms of ammunition recovered." He did not write, "The people trying to kill us live in the valley below us, and probably have grandmothers who hum." The report went into the battalion records. The gap stayed where it was. The prisoner was brought in on the 25th. A man of approximately 50 years, weathered in the way of men who have worked outdoors in mountain terrain for most of their lives. His hands carrying the specific callousing of agricultural labor, his clothing civilian, not the remnants of a uniform, not the equipment of a soldier, but the ordinary work clothes of a man who had been doing something practical when circumstances intervened. He had been found near a trail junction. He had not been armed, which either meant he was not a partisan or meant he was a partisan who had disposed of his weapon before capture. And in the operational reality of rear area security, these two possibilities were treated as functionally equivalent. He was brought to the relay point under guard, and Farid was summoned to translate. Farid looked at the man and spoke to him in Russian. The man said nothing. Farid tried Georgian phrases he had picked up from a classmate in Ganja. Nothing. Kamal, who had grown up in Mingachevir, near the border regions, where trade had historically required a functional vocabulary in several languages, watched this process for a moment and then said something, a few words in what Amir recognized as Lezgian, or something close to it, a language that ran along the mountain borders in ways that official maps did not always capture. The man looked at Kamal. He spoke. Kamal listened. His expression did not change. But something in the quality of his stillness changed. The stillness of a man receiving information rather than waiting for it. He listened until the man finished, and then he translated slowly, choosing his words. The man had said, "Why are you on the wrong side?" Not as an accusation, not as a political statement, as a genuine question expressed with the directness of a man who has decided that, having nothing left to lose, he might as well ask what he actually wants to know. The question sat in the air of the relay point. No one answered it. Not because there was no answer. There were several answers, all of them true, none of them sufficient. Because the circumstances of the camp in Poland were a true answer. Because the mathematics of survival were a true answer. Because Amir had been a Red Army officer, and Kamal had fought at Sevastopol, and Donnie had been 19 and scared, and had signed a form in a language he did not fully read. And all of these were true answers. But none of them answered the question the man had actually asked, which was not about circumstances, but about something more fundamental. About the relationship between what a man does and what a man is, about whether the uniform determines the side or the other way around. The man was transferred to German headquarters later that day. They never learned what happened to him after that. Amir thought about the question for the rest of that day, and for many days afterward, carrying it along the trail the way you carry something that has no place to be set down. He had answers. All of them were true. None of them were sufficient. The man had not asked why he was wearing a German uniform. He had asked something harder than that, whether the uniform and what it represented and what it required of him was something he had chosen or something that had happened to him. And Amir, who had spent 11 days on a troop train and 3 months in the mud of the Caucasus, arriving at this moment, did not know how to answer a question whose answer would require him to know, with certainty, where exactly the line ran between surviving and becoming. Kamal wrote nothing on his supply form that evening. Rauf asked what the prisoner had said. Kamal told him. Rauf was quiet for a long moment and then said that his grandfather had asked himself the same question in 1918 and had never come to a satisfactory answer. Nobody found this particularly surprising. The nights in the forest had their own texture, distinct from any darkness Amir had experienced before. The valleys of the Caucasus at night in October were not merely dark. They were inhabited by darkness, a darkness that had mass and presence. That pressed against the face like something physical. In Baku, where he had studied before the war, there was always some ambient light, the glow of the refineries, the lights of the harbor, the reflected illumination of a city that never fully slept. Even in the camp in Poland, there had been the distant lights of the guard towers, malevolent but present. Here there was nothing. The forest absorbed light the way it absorbed sound, completely and without return. And the men adapted in the ways that men adapt to things they cannot change. They developed routines, small rituals of the predictable within the unpredictable. Rauf took it upon himself to assess the quality of each night's darkness, rating it on a scale that he had invented and that no one had asked for, but that everyone understood. Total, heavy, navigable. The distinctions seemed arbitrary until the night when he said navigable, and it turned out he was right. And that the clouds had thinned enough to allow a faint starlight through, and the patrol that night was measurably easier than those on the nights he had called heavy. After that, people listened when Ralph assessed the darkness. Kamal organized the cooking fire attempts with the same methodical precision he brought to the supply tallies. Each evening, a designated man was assigned the task of finding dry material, bark shaved from the undersides of fallen logs, the dead interior wood of standing stumps that sometimes retained dryness despite the surface conditions, dried grass from the few exposed rocky outcrops where rainfall ran off rather than soaking in. The collected material was stored in a designated pouch, body temperature keeping it marginally drier than the ambient air. The attempts mostly failed. When they succeeded, even partially, when a small flame held for long enough to heat a mess tin to something above the temperature of the rain, the event was received by the men around it with a quality of attention that had nothing to do with the practical value of slightly warmed food and everything to do with the human need for fire, which is older than any of the reasons people have given for it. Donnie, on the nights when a fire was achieved, would sit closest to it. He was, of all of them, was the one for whom the cold was most physiologically damaging. The trench foot was worsening, his feet generating their own cold from the inside, the dying flesh a refrigerant rather than a heat source, and he sat close to whatever fire existed and held his hands near it without speaking, and his face in the firelight had an expression of such uncomplicated gratitude that it was sometimes difficult to look at. He was 19. He had signed a form in a language he did not fully read. When he was sitting in a foxhole in the Caucasus with ruined feet, and when there was a small fire, he sat next to it and was grateful for the light. Amir watched him. He watched all of them. It was part of what the command role required, the maintenance of a continuous awareness of the condition of the men, an ongoing assessment of who was approaching the limit and who had reserve, who needed to be pulled back and who could be pushed. But with Donnie, the watching had an additional quality, something that was not strictly professional, that belonged to the category of things that the forms and reports did not capture. He was watching to see what 19 looked like when it had been asked to carry more than 19 can reasonably carry. He was watching to see if the boy would bend or break, and which of those outcomes was worse in the specific circumstances, and whether he had made the right decision in letting him stay. Danny did not break. He bent continuously in the direction of the pain and the cold and the hunger and the grinding daily repetition of a situation that offered no improvement and no end. He bent in the direction of all of it, and he kept bending, and he did not break. And every evening when the watch rotations were assigned, he was present for his, standing in the position Amir had designated, eyes forward, weapon ready, his ruined feet bearing his weight without complaint in his presence, and with whatever complaint they required in his absence. Who replaces me? It was not a question anymore by November. It had become something else, a statement of fact, a description of the situation, a reason that had been offered once and accepted and did not need to be repeated because it was still true, and they both knew it was still true. And the truth of it was the reason Amir did not say the things he wanted to say, on which were, you need a hospital, you need rest, you need dry socks and warm food, and someone to tell you that what you are doing here is not what your life was supposed to be, that the form you signed without reading was not a contract, that 19 years old is not old enough to be owed this. He did not say these things. He assigned the watches. He patrolled his section. He wrote the reports. By the first week of November, Danny could no longer walk properly. And the trench foot had progressed past the stage where it could be managed through will and the substitution of rags for socks. The medic, a former medical student from Lankaran, who had been performing, with 2 years of interrupted coursework and a German field kit of limited contents, the work of a trained physician, had told Amir 10 days earlier that the boy needed to be evacuated to the aid station in the lowlands. Amir had told Danny. Danny had said, "Who replaces me?" The answer was nobody. The battalion that had arrived with 963 men was operating with fewer than 700 effective. The sick list grew daily. The mechanism for replacement did not exist, or if it existed in some document in some headquarters in Krasnodar, it had not translated into actual men arriving to replace the ones the mountains and the rain and the partisans and the dysentery were taking. Amir had let him stay, was he would carry this decision for a long time. Not because it was wrong necessarily. Danny was right that there was no replacement, and an undermanned platoon on a contested supply route had a calculus of its own. But because of the particular quality of the moment when he had looked at the boy's face and seen in it the expression of someone offering themselves, not out of heroism, but out of the same inability to leave that had made Tarlan run across the mudslide toward Ilgar. The inability to accept that you are the one who gets to step back while others absorb what needs to be absorbed. He had looked at Danny's face and recognized what was in it because it was something he had felt himself, and he had made the calculation and let him stay. Danny walked on his ruined feet. An awe in his face when he walked was a study in controlled blankness, the expression of a man managing pain by refusing to allow it the dignity of acknowledgement. And he stood his watches and he patrolled his section, and he gave portions of his rations to children in villages they passed through quietly when he thought Amir was not watching. Amir was always watching. He never said anything about it again. Kamal stood at the relay point on the afternoon of October 30th and counted the casualty evacuations coming down from Simashko. He stood to the side of the path, supply form in hand, pencil moving in its precise columns. 4 stretchers, 2 walking wounded. One man who was not wounded at all, but who had stopped speaking 3 days ago and was being led between 2 orderlies with the blank cooperation of someone who has agreed to be present physically while being absent in every other sense. The Gebirgsjäger carrying the stretchers were gray with exhaustion and weather, moving with the particular erosion of men who have been at altitude under fire, without adequate food or rest or shelter, for longer than the human organism was designed to sustain. And they did not look at the Azerbaijanis as they passed. They did not look at much of anything. They looked at the path ahead, and they walked, and they delivered what they were carrying, and then they turned around and went back up. From the Edelweiss units committed at Simashko, built around the 98th Regiment, the men who had taken the summit and were holding it against daily counterattacks through mud and fog and temperatures that were now, at altitude, dropping toward zero, the losses between the 21st of October and mid-December would reach more than 800 killed, over 2,000 wounded, nearly 200 missing, from a single battle group, on a single mountain, for the privilege of a view of clouds. Kamal counted the stretchers. He wrote the number on his supply form. He said nothing. The numbers told him something that the official communications, with their language of positions held and objectives consolidated and advances suspended pending improvement in conditions, did not say and would not say. The numbers told him that the throat was constricting, that what passed through it was becoming insufficient, that the mountain was performing its own arithmetic, and its arithmetic was different from the 17th Army's arithmetic. And in the contest between them, the mountain had not yet lost and showed no sign of beginning to. He capped his pencil. He looked at the ridgeline to the south, where the Gebirgsjäger held their positions on Simashko, above a sea that was invisible in the cloud, that had been invisible for days that might, for all practical purposes, have ceased to exist. Then he went back to his section. The mules needed loading. The trail needed walking. The throat needed to keep breathing, for as long as it could. Regardless of what the numbers said about how this was going to end, the offensive died the way most things die in war. Not with a declaration, not with a ceremony or a document, or a moment that could be pointed to afterward and named. It died the way a fire dies when the wood runs out and the rain keeps falling. Gradually, then completely, the warmth receding by degrees until one morning you put your hand near what was the fire and feel nothing. And you understand that what you are looking at is not a fire anymore, but the memory of one, the 4th of November. Ernst mentioned the date in the morning, checking the small calendar he kept in his breast pocket with the methodical consistency of a man who has decided that the progression of numbered days is one of the few things still within his power to track accurately. He said it in German, and Amir did not need Farid to translate. He understood numbers in German. He understood the 4th of November in any language. 3 weeks since the offensive began, 1 week of advance, 2 weeks of something that the official communications called consolidation, and that everyone standing in the mud of the Caucasus called by its correct name, which was stopping. The attack that the intelligence summary had predicted for that morning did not come. Attacks from intelligence summaries rarely came, or came in places and at times bearing no relationship to the summary, which was produced by staff officers in Krasnodar, working from information that was, by the time it reached them, already old enough to be useless. They stood to before dawn in the cold and the dark, weapons ready, eyes on the tree line, and the tree line produced nothing but the ordinary darkness of a forest at 4 in the morning. And they stood down at mid-morning and returned to the routine that had become their existence. Patrol, carry, escort, return. In the 4 movements of a symphony that never resolved, that played the same passage over and over in different keys of mud and weather and exhaustion. Something had changed, though. Not in the routine, which was unchangeable, and in its unchangeability had become almost comforting. The comfort of the known, even when the known is bad. What had changed was in the air around the routine, in the way orders were phrased and delivered, were in the faces of the German staff officers who occasionally appeared at the relay point and looked at the trails and the mountains and the rain with an expression Amir had learned to read as institutional doubt. The doubt of men who have been telling themselves one story and are beginning to understand that the story and the facts have separated. Late on the 4th of November, Ernst came back from the relay point with something in his expression that Amir had not seen before. Not fear. And Ernst was not a man who showed fear in any legible form. Something more considered than fear. The expression of a man who has received information and is deciding with great care what to do with it. He had spoken with a Feldwebel from the 98th Regiment who had come down from Simashko with a casualty detail. 4 stretchers, 2 walking wounded. One man who was not wounded, but who had stopped speaking 3 days ago and was being led between 2 orderlies with the blank cooperation of someone who has agreed to be present physically while being absent in every other sense. The Feldwebel had told Ernst something. Ernst turned to Amir afterward and made the gesture. The encompassing gesture that took in the trail, the rain, the mountains, the cloud-covered ridgeline above which the Gebirgsjäger held their positions, and the entire geometry of the situation, and said a single word. Fertig, finished. The word fell into the cold air and stayed there. Amir looked at the mountains. The mountains looked back with the indifference they had shown since the beginning, since the marshalling yard at Krasnodar and the first sight of those ridgelines in the cloud. That quality of complete disregard for human intention that is not hostility, but is, in its way, more defeating than hostility would be. Hostility can be matched. Indifference cannot. All offensive operations in the region had been suspended. The mountain had won. What no official communication conveyed, and what the faces of the men coming down from Simashko communicated without words, was the condition of the forces that had been fighting there. The Gebirgsjäger, the mountain troops, the Austrians and Bavarians and Tyroleans, who had been selected and trained for exactly this kind of terrain, he who had grown up at altitude and knew the grammar of rock and weather in ways that most soldiers never learn, were dying. Not only from Soviet fire, though that was constant and effective, and the counterattacks came daily, the 383rd and 353rd Rifle Divisions pushing from the south with the particular tenacity of men defending the approaches to their own coast. They were dying from the mountain itself. Exposure, disease, the cumulative erasure of bodies that had been at altitude, in weather, under fire, without adequate food or shelter or rest, for weeks beyond what the organism was designed to sustain. Half of them, by the division doctor's report that filtered down through the usual distortions of the command chain, were suffering from gastrointestinal illness. The water sources were contaminated. The latrines, where latrines existed, were flooded, and the men were drinking from streams that carried whatever the rain washed down from the positions above, which included, in some cases, the decomposition products of the dead. They had not had warm food either. The fires that Amir's platoon could not light in the valley could not be lit on the mountain. The Soviet positions were close enough, in some places fewer than 200 meters, that any flame visible at night drew immediate fire. The men ate cold. They slept in rain. They fought in mud. and the mountain which they had taken at such cost gave them in return only the view, when the clouds permitted, in of a sea they could not reach. The men on Mashko knew what the supplies meant. The ammunition that allowed them to hold positions, the Soviets counterattacked daily. The medical supplies that kept the wounded from dying of infection before evacuation. The rations that maintained some minimal caloric intake in bodies consuming themselves. All of it passed through the 12 kilometers of forested trail that Amir's battalion guarded. The partisans understood this too. With the offensive stalled, with the front line static and the Gebirgsjäger dug in on the ridges they held, the irregular forces in the forest below had more freedom of movement and used it. The attacks on convoys continued through November with a regularity that suggested coordination, as if someone on the other side of the ridge was communicating the supply schedule. Perhaps someone was. Amir did not write this in his reports either. And the sick list was the most honest document produced during that period. It did not use the language of objectives and consolidation. It did not speak of positions held or advances pending improvement in conditions. It simply listed names and diagnoses and the dates on which men had ceased to be effective, and the names accumulated with a consistency that was more eloquent than any operational summary. Dysentery came first. And the same illness that was destroying the Gebirgsjäger on Mashko came down the mountain in the water and found them on the trails. Then respiratory infections, inevitable in men who were wet and cold and sleeping in the open, whose immune systems had been compromised by the camps and by months of inadequate nutrition before they ever arrived in the Caucasus. Then feet. The feet were worst. Trench foot. The medic used the German term, and Farid translated it uncertainly, as if the condition were so specific to this particular combination of cold and wet in duration that it resisted clean transfer into Azerbaijani. The flesh of the foot, constantly saturated in cold, begins to die. The skin goes white, then gray. The pain begins as burning and progresses to something the men described, when they described it at all, as walking on bones from which the flesh has been removed. Dani's left foot was worse than his right. He showed Amir one evening in the dugout, a hole scraped from the hillside and roofed with branches that leaked in a dozen places, producing a steady interior drip that was somehow worse than simply being outside in the rain because it had the quality of betrayal, shelter that was not shelter, protection that protected against nothing. Danny unwrapped the rags he had substituted for socks that had disintegrated weeks ago, and the skin of his soles was white and wrinkled and wrong. The skin of a man who had been in water too long, which in every sense he had. He could not feel his toes. He demonstrated this by pressing each one with a fingernail, watching Amir's face for the reaction that his own foot was not providing. He could walk, he said. He demonstrated this too, standing and taking 3 steps across the dugout with his face arranged in the controlled blankness of a man managing pain by refusing to allow it the dignity of acknowledgement. The same expression he had been wearing for 2 weeks, the expression that Amir had stopped trying to argue with because the argument always arrived at the same place. Who replaces me? Nobody. He was still giving portions of his rations to children in the villages they passed through. Amir had stopped telling him not to. The calculation had shifted. The boy had almost nothing left to give and was giving it anyway. And there was something in this that was either the most foolish thing Amir had witnessed during the campaign or the most necessary, and he no longer felt confident about which. In the fall of 1950, at a place called the Chosin Reservoir in North Korea, United States Marines carried ammunition on their backs through temperatures of minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit for distances that should have been impossible given what their bodies had already been through. Well, they did this because the men on the ridge above needed the ammunition, and because there was no other way to get it there, and because the alternative, letting the men on the ridge run out, was not something they were willing to do the arithmetic on. The mathematics of that choice are not complicated, they are simply brutal. In the Caucasus in November 1942, the temperatures were not minus 30. They were cold enough. The distances were not impossible. They were long enough. The men carrying the loads were not Marines who had volunteered for service and understood the nature of the commitment. They were men who had been starved into signing a form in a language they did not fully read. The mathematics were the same. The choice, to keep walking, to keep carrying, to keep moving supplies up a mountain toward men who needed them, in conditions that were systematically destroying the carriers, was made every day, without ceremony, by men who had no flag to carry it under, and no story that would remember them for it. They kept walking. The mountain kept taking. The rumors from Stalingrad arrived in fragments. This was the nature of information in that environment. It came in pieces, partial and contradictory, and filtered through so many layers of translation and compression that by the time it reached the men on the supply trails, it had the quality of rumor rather than intelligence. Something was happening at Stalingrad, a Soviet offensive, a breakthrough, a German army surrounded or about to be surrounded in a city on the Volga that was very far from the Caucasus, and also in ways that were becoming apparent without being stated, not far at all. The German staff officers discussed it in lowered voices. Ernst's jaw tightened when the runners came through with dispatches he read and did not share. Amir asked him once directly what was happening at Stalingrad. Nana Ernst looked at him for a moment longer than was usual between them. Longer than the functional transaction of gesture in broken Russian that constituted their normal communication. The look of a man deciding how much of what he knows to allow into the space between himself and someone else. Then he said something in German that Farid, standing nearby, translated slowly. The lieutenant says he does not know, but the way Ernst's eyes moved when he said it meant something else. The men sensed it without being able to articulate what they sensed. They did not have the information, did not read the dispatches, did not understand the strategic geometry that connected their 12 kilometers of mountain trail to the vast machinery of the Eastern Front. But soldiers develop a faculty for detecting change in institutional mood. A shift in tone, a new hesitation in the delivery of orders, a quality of silence in the spaces between communications that is different from ordinary silence. This faculty was by mid-November fully engaged. The conversations in the dugout at night changed character. The nostalgic talk of men remembering food and women, and the Caspian, and the particular smell of Baku in summer, gave way to something more speculative, more careful. The conditional tense, which had always been present in discussions of the future, became the dominant mode. Someone, Amir did not remember who, asked aloud one evening what would happen to them if the Germans lost. The question sat in the dugout air without being answered, because every possible answer was worse than not knowing. If the Germans lost, they were 963 men, fewer now, far fewer now, wearing German uniforms in a Soviet country, having spent 3 months fighting against Soviet forces and Soviet partisans and the local population. The Red Army did not have a category for what they were that ended well. The Soviet legal system did not have a category for what they were that ended well. They had signed a form. The form was in German. The alternative had been visible in the faces of the men who stayed behind in the camp in Poland, in the way their cheekbones pressed outward through skin that had gone the color of old paper. None of this constituted, under the circumstances, a satisfying answer to the question of what would happen to them if the Germans lost. The question remained in the air. Nobody slept well that night. They lost Namig on the 7th, shot through the chest during an ambush on the northern section, dead before he reached the ground. They lost Farid on the 11th. He stepped on a mine the partisans had placed on the trail during the night, a wooden case device that no metal detector, had they been issued metal detectors, would have found. The medic saved his left leg. He could not save the right. Farid was evacuated south toward a field hospital in the lowlands, and Amir never learned what became of him after that. The cold deepened. The first snow on the valley floor came on the morning of the 9th, a thin dusting on the rocks above the tree line that disappeared by midday but announced with the quiet certainty of a fact that cannot be argued with, the arrival of what came next. The evening of the 16th of November, the rain stopped. This was remarkable enough to wake men who had been asleep. Not the stopping itself. Rain stopped periodically, but the quality of what replaced it. Not the damp stillness of a pause between downpours, the sky merely gathering itself for the next effort, but something different, a genuine clearing. The clouds pulling back from the southern ridgeline, and then from the valley walls, and then from the sky overhead, revealing first stars and then more stars, and then a sky of such extraordinary clarity, such pure cold depth, that men who had been living under cloud for weeks came out of their dugouts and simply stood and looked at it. Amir walked the evening patrol, a routine circuit of the positions, checking sentries, verifying fields of fire, the standard nocturnal choreography of a defensive line in contact. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. The ground underfoot was frozen at the surface for the first time, giving his footsteps a new quality, a crispness that had been absent from movement for so long that it felt foreign. At the southern sentry post, he found Ralph on watch. Ralph was 32 years old and had been ill, on and off, for 3 weeks. Not ill enough to be evacuated, but ill enough that his face had taken on the particular gray quality of sustained low-grade fever. The look of a man whose body is conducting a battle on a second front simultaneously with everything else it is being asked to do. He was standing in the correct position, weapon held correctly, eyes directed correctly forward. He was also shaking, not from cold alone. Amir told him his watch was almost done. Ralph nodded. They stood together for a moment, looking south toward the ridge where the Gebirgsjäger held their positions on Semashko, and where below and beyond it, past the dark descent of forested slope, the Black Sea lay in the darkness. Invisible. Present. Ralph said he could hear something. Amir listened. At first there was nothing. The silence of a mountain forest on a clear, cold night. The distant sound of water moving over rock. The creak of branches contracting in the cold. The particular quality of stillness that descends when the wind drops, and the forest stops its constant low conversation and becomes for a moment simply itself. Then, faintly from the north, a low rhythmic thudding felt as much as heard. That could have been artillery or could have been something else entirely. It came and went with the movement of air, present for a few seconds, then gone, then present again, like a signal being transmitted at the edge of reception. Amir told Ralph it was probably nothing. Ralph agreed it was probably nothing. They both knew it was not nothing. The positions became static. The Gebirgsjäger dug in on the ridges they held, Semashko and the surrounding heights. The Soviets dug in on the ridges they held. Between them, the mountain existed in its permanent state, indifferent to both, the ground that they were fighting over continuing to be ground, rock and forest and water, and the specific topography of a place that had been there before any of them arrived, and would be there after all of them were gone. The supplies that Amir's battalion carried changed character. No longer the ammunition and equipment of an advancing force, the forward-looking material of an army that expects to be somewhere else next week. Now the maintenance supplies of a force holding in place, enduring rather than attacking, surviving rather than advancing. The difference was invisible in the physical weight of the boxes. It was present in everything else. On the night of the 16th, after the patrol, after standing with Ralph at the southern post and listening to the nothing that might have been something, Amir found Ernst sitting outside the main dugout. This was unusual. Ernst was a man who used shelter when shelter was available, who managed his body's resources with the same precision he brought to everything else. Sitting outside in the cold when there was a dugout available was not the kind of choice he made without reason. Amir sat beside him. For a long time, neither of them said anything. The stars were still out, the sky still holding its improbable clarity above the black tree line, and the cold was the dry, sharp cold that precedes snowfall, rather than the wet cold of the weeks of rain. And in some ways this was better, and in some ways it was worse because at least the rain had been familiar, had been continuous, had been something you could define yourself against. Ernst reached into his breast pocket and produced 2 cigarettes. He offered one to Amir. Amir did not smoke, but he took it. They sat with the cigarettes and the stars. Then Ernst began to speak. He spoke for longer than he had spoken at any point in the 3 months they had been operating together. His German was unhurried and precise, and Amir understood perhaps a third of it directly and waited for Farid, who had appeared with the instinct for being present when language was needed that was his most valuable quality, to render the rest. If Farid translated slowly, sitting on his heels nearby, his voice low. Ernst said, "I was at Sevastopol. Your Sergeant Kamal was on the other side. I know this because I asked him once, through you, what battle he was at when he was captured, and he said Sevastopol. And the dates he gave were the dates of my own deployment there. We were in the same city at the same time, on opposite sides of the same lines. He paused. He said, I have thought about this many times. Farid translated. Esamir listened. Ernst said, we were both following orders we did not write, in a place we had not chosen, for objectives neither of us had been consulted about. I was doing my duty. He was doing his duty. We would have killed each other if given the opportunity, and neither of us would have called it murder because the forms we had signed and the uniforms we wore placed the killing in a different category. He drew on the cigarette. He said, I don't know what that makes us. I have been trying to decide for a long time, and I don't know. There was a long silence. Amir thought about Sevastopol, which he had never seen. He thought about Kamal counting stretchers at the relay point with his precise columns and his stub of pencil, maintaining the numerical record of something that resisted being reduced to numbers, but that numbers were the only honest language for. He thought about Tarlan running across the mudslide and about the piece of paper with the Sumgait address that Ralph still kept folded in his pocket. He thought about the woman humming in the village and about Danny's face when he heard it. He did not answer Ernst's question. There was no answer that was not also a different question. But he sat with the question, and Ernst sat with it. And the stars turned slowly overhead. When on somewhere beyond the ridgeline and the forests and the mud and the invisible sea, the war continued without them and without conclusion. What happened after is a matter of record, though the record is incomplete in the ways that records involving men who lost are always incomplete. The German offensive toward Tuapse, toward the coastal road, toward Sukhumi, toward the oil fields of Baku that were supposed to fuel 1,000 years of empire, failed. And the 17th Army did not reach the coast. The 4th Mountain Division held Mashko through the winter and then withdrew in the following year as the overall German position in the Caucasus deteriorated, as the disaster at Stalingrad unwound the strategic logic that had sent them there, as the arithmetic that Kemal had been tracking with his pencil on a supply form since Poland finally resolved in the only direction it had always been going to resolve. The Azerbaijani battalion was withdrawn from the supply routes in December. The men who had carried the supplies and walked the trails and lost their friends in the mud of the forested valleys were transported north and then west, following the receding tide of an army that was no longer advancing and had begun the long process of understanding what retreat meant at that scale in that war. 963 men had left Jadula. Fewer than 700 left the Caucasus. The count of what happened to the survivors after the war is less precise, for reasons that have to do with which side's record survived and whose story was considered worth preserving. Some were captured by Soviet forces as the German position in the east collapsed. They were processed under Article 58 of the Soviet Criminal Code. The article that covered treason, broadly defined, it defined broadly enough to include having signed a form in a camp in Poland because the alternative was visible in the faces of the men around you. The sentences range from execution to 25 years in the labor camps of the Gulag system, which was itself a kind of arithmetic. The arithmetic of what the state does with men who survive something they were not supposed to survive. So some escaped westward and spent the remaining decades of their lives in displaced persons camps in Germany or Austria, living under different names, building small, careful lives in the gap between what they had been and what they were allowed to become, never entirely sure which of the two versions of themselves was the true one. A few returned to Azerbaijan, quietly, when the political climate allowed. They did not talk about what they had done. They planted gardens. They worked. And they got old. The men who had been young in the forests of the Caucasus became, over decades, old men sitting in doorways in the way that the old men in those forested villages had sat, watching something pass, having already watched too many things pass. Having arrived at the place where watching is the only appropriate response because you have learned, at sufficient cost, that intervention changes the thing passing, but does not stop the passing. Ralph kept the folded paper with the address in Sumgait. He kept it for 41 years. In 1983, in a city in West Germany where he had lived since 1946, under a name that was close to his own but not his own, he wrote a letter to the address. He did not know if anyone still lived there. He did not know if the building was still standing. He wrote the letter in Azerbaijani, which he had not written in 4 decades, waited the letters coming back to his hand with the muscle memory of things learned young. He said that he had known a man named Tarlin who had kept this address in his pocket. He said that Tarlin had died in the Caucasus in October 1942. He said that Tarlin had run towards someone who needed help, and that this was the last thing he had done, and that Ralph had thought someone should know this. He did not know if the letter arrived. He did not receive a reply. He had not expected one. He folded the paper one more time, though it was already folded as small as it would go. He put it in the drawer of the small desk in his small apartment in the small city in West Germany, where he had lived for 37 years under a name that was almost his own. Then he made tea. He drank it standing at the window, looking at the street below, where children were riding bicycles in the late afternoon light. And the city went about its business the way cities do, without reference to what had happened in it or near it or because of it. The old man's question, the farmer, the prisoner, the man with the agricultural calluses on his hands who had looked at 963 Azerbaijanis in German uniforms and asked the only honest question available. That question did not go away with him when the Germans took him to headquarters. It stayed in the relay point. It stayed in the mud of the trails. It stayed in the careful columns of Kemal's supply form, and in the folded paper in Ralph's pocket, and in the specific quality of silence that settled over the men in the dugout at night when they had stopped talking and had not yet fallen asleep. Why are you on the wrong side? Perhaps the truest answer, the one that none of them said because none of them had the language for it yet, was this. We were never on a side. We were simply men, trying to remain men. We in conditions designed to make that impossible. What the official German records show, for those who know where to look, is a battalion that performed its assigned function. Rear area security along the supply routes of the 4th Mountain Division, with adequate proficiency given its training, equipment, and the conditions in which it operated. The records show casualties. They show convoy escort statistics, ambush contact reports, partisan activity assessments. They show the kind of information that staff officers require in order to believe they understand what is happening in the places they are responsible for but cannot see. What the records do not show is Kemal's supply form, the one he had been filling since Krakow, the pencil marks recording the days and the numbers, the lists of what was available and what was needed, and the growing gap between the two. That form, if it still exists somewhere, Reichhorn would be a more complete record of what happened in those valleys than anything in the official archive. It would show the arithmetic of the throat, how much moved, how little arrived, how many men carried how many kilograms over how many kilometers in how many hours of how much rain. It would show in Kemal's precise columns the process by which 963 men became 700 effective became fewer, into the subtraction worked by altitude and weather and disease, and the patience of people who had been living in these forests longer than the German army had been planning to use them. Kemal survived the war. He was one of the men who traveled west with the retreating German forces and ended up in a displaced persons camp in the American occupation zone in Bavaria in 1945. He was there for 3 years, during which time he kept lists, not because the lists served any administrative function, but because keeping lists was what he did, and the practice had survived everything else that had not survived, and it was his. In 1948, he was resettled in West Germany under a program for stateless persons that gave him a new document and a new status without giving him a new country. He worked in a factory that made precision instruments, gauges, measurement devices, tools for assessing quantities. The work suited him. He lived in Munich until 1979. He died of a cardiac event quietly in a hospital where the nurses spoke German and he spoke Azerbaijani, and the gap between them was managed by a young doctor from Turkey who had enough of both languages to ensure that the relevant information was transferred. His effects, when inventoried by the hospital, included a supply form, much folded, heavily annotated, almost illegible in places where the pencil marks had been worn to ghost by decades of handling. The hospital staff, not knowing what to do with it, filed it with the unclaimed personal effects documentation. It is presumably still there. Downey did not survive. He was evacuated from the Caucasus in December 1942, when the battalion was withdrawn, his feet sufficiently damaged by the trench foot to require treatment that the field medic could not provide. He was sent to a military hospital in Rostov, where the administrative category of his situation, Azerbaijani auxiliary, German uniform, Soviet territory, an uncertain future, proved too complex for the existing bureaucratic categories to manage quickly. He was still in the hospital when Rostov fell to Soviet forces in February 1943. What the Soviet army did with a 19-year-old Azerbaijani in a German uniform in a hospital in Rostov in February 1943 is not recorded in any document that has been located. He would have been 20 years old. Amir's fate is the least documented of any of them, which may be because he was the most careful, or because the records of his particular path through the post-war dispersal were destroyed, or because someone decided they should not be kept. What is known from a single reference in a post-war Soviet investigation into the Azerbaijani Legion is that a man matching his description, former Red Army lieutenant, captured at Kharkov, served with the battalion in the Caucasus, was interviewed by Soviet intelligence officers in Berlin in May 1945. The interviewing officer's report notes that the subject was cooperative and provided detailed information about the battalion's operations. It notes that the subject spoke German with unusual fluency for someone of his background. It does not note what happened to the subject after the interview concluded. The investigation file ends there, as files sometimes do when the relevant decisions have been made and the documentation of those decisions is considered unnecessary. And Ernst returned to Innsbruck. He had been there before the war, working in his family's hardware business, climbing on weekends in the mountains around the city, living the ordinary life of a man whose country had not yet decided to make extraordinary demands of him. After the war, he returned to the hardware business and the mountains. His left arm retained its stiffness until he died in 1971. He never spoke publicly about the Caucasus or about the battalion he had been attached to. His son, Hatur, who was 8 years old when Ernst returned from the war, and who grew up watching his father move through the world with the particular economy of a man conserving something, asked him once only, about the war. Ernst looked at him for a long moment and then said that it had been cold and that the mountains had been beautiful and that he had known men he would not have expected to know. His son understood that this was the complete answer and that there would be no further elaboration. And he accepted it, because some answers are complete even when they are not full. Every war produces men like these, men who fought not for a flag, not for an ideology they had chosen, not for a nation that claimed them. Men who fought because the alternative was a slow death in a field in Poland, or a rice paddy in Vietnam, or a desert in Iraq, or any of the other places where the machinery of history has produced the same arithmetic and asked the same men to solve it with their bodies. Or history has a word for soldiers who lose. It calls them collaborators. It calls them casualties. It calls them, most efficiently of all, nothing. It simply does not call them, does not write them into the accounts of what happened and why it mattered, leaves them in the gap between the records of the victors and the records of the defeated, where the men who were on neither side and both sides simultaneously tend to accumulate. But the men who were there know a different word. They call it survival. And they have spent their lives being not entirely sure whether that is something to be proud of, or something to carry quietly, or something that exists in a category that the available language has not yet found a name for. The mountains above Tuapse still stand. The beech and hornbeam forests still cover the valleys where the supply trails ran. The streams still cross the paths at the same points. The narrow sections where a column could be forced into single file are still narrow. In spring, the gentian flowers bloom on the southern slopes, the same alpine flower that gave the 4th Mountain Division its name, indifferent to the naming, flowering because flowering is what it does. The mountains did not notice the war. They have not noticed the peace. They continue.